My name's Monk Rowe, and I'm very pleased to be talking to Dr. Albert Vollmer. After a long time waiting to do so, Hamilton class of 52, right?
Right.
That's, so you're back for your
65th
65th
reunion.
reunion. That's terrific.
Yeah.
And we had a brief, I had overheard you talking a little bit about the music that you heard at Hamilton, and that you heard someone playing a Fats Waller record or
Well, actually, it
something
was
like
a General Morton record that was
Oh.
coming out of Carnegie Hall.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew it had to be upperclassmen. It wasn't my class. We were all in South Dorm.
Oh,
And so I went in and I found the where it was coming from and met some upperclassmen because of it. One of them particularly, Bill Robbins, as I remember.
why did you already know this music before you got to Hamilton?
Okay. I grew up from age of 10 outside of Stockholm, Sweden. And I came to the United States when I was 17. So I lived in Sweden between the age of 10 and 17. And when we were 15 or 16, a number of us started getting interested in, well, it was during the war. So not too much was coming into Sweden, but we did see the movie Sun Valley Serenade, which had Glenn Miller, Chattanooga Choo Choo, and all of that, and In the Mood. And so we were excited by that, and we could get the Joe Loss recording of In the Mood, which was a British recording, which was a total cover of the Glenn Miller recording.
Joe Loss?
Joe Loss was a band leader in England who recorded for HMV.
Okay.
And he had a band that was quite famous, and we could get, somehow or other, that recording was available. Eventually I even got perhaps the most original recording, which was the Edgar Hayes recording, because that had Joe Garland in it, and Joe Garland wrote the tune. Now, little did I know at the time that the Joe Loss copy of the Glenn Miller arrangement and recording was an arrangement by Eddie Durham. And Eddie Durham later on was in the Harlem Blues Jazz Band for 11 years.
Oh.
And he also plays on Glenn Miller's Slip Horn Jive, which I think he wrote that.
Mm-hmm.
And Eddie Durham, as far as I'm concerned, there were two exceptional, I'll call them American musical geniuses, two exceptional musicians who have gone through the Harlem Blues Jazz Band. One was Roger Ram Ramirez, the pianist, and the other was Eddie Durham. And Eddie Durham, it was a whole education to be around him, because he was very modest, but he had done an awful lot.
Okay. I'm going to flip back to Hamilton for a minute, and then we'll come back to that. Because I was curious, you were at Hamilton from
48 to 52. Yeah.
Was there a division in things that people wanted to listen to? You liked
jazz wasn't accepted at Hamilton then, no. Because I remember I'd learned some blues chords, and I was playing them in Silman Hall, and one of the which was the music department at the time, and one of the professors looked in, and I had to tell him what I was doing wasn't jazz. I mean, I was just noodling on the piano. Well, because he said, well, he almost felt like, that he couldn't perceive what was jazz, because maybe nobody was telling him, or anyway. Well, I think that there was a prejudice against jazz by the older generation. There just was, because and we have it in the language. And the language is very important. We call classical music serious music, and therefore semantically pop music or jazz music or whatever happens to be what the people come up with is then frivolous.
Your frat brothers would have been listening to what else?
Well, I educated many of them. My friend, we were all in Sayu House, and I was the one with the jazz collection.
Okay, but what did they have, or didn't they have anything in particular? Did they have, you know what I think my question
Well, actually,
is?
you know, the LP came out
Yeah,
at that time.
so what
And
was
we
the
had
top?
and we had Georgia Bakian's Louis Armstrong Hot Fives, Hot Sevens on the
Right.
Columbia Green label.
Okay. The non-jazz music that they might have been listening to was what?
I don't know.
Vocalists?
I don't know. I just
Okay.
remember when I first started walking around New York by myself, before I even went to high school. I came in the summer. I'm looking over, a four-leaf clover was coming out of every
Little store
side,
had the thing.
every storefront.
That's a
So
pretty
that was the thing of yeah. And of course, well, I mean, I guess Frank Sinatra. You know, a lot of people think he's a jazz singer. I think he's a very good singer, but I don't really put him as a jazz singer. But that may be just my particular taste. And there was Vollmer and Rowe. I mean, all of those people were the pop people.
Okay.
Yeah.
This might have been after you left Hamilton, but there was a short-lived renewed interest in Dixieland and hot music. Do you recall when that? I believe it was in the early to mid 50s.
Yeah. Well, that's when the stuff was coming out of New Orleans, and there was that revival. Look magazine went down there and filmed, and of course the dean of them all was Bill Russell, and his American music, and there were other people who were. I've forgotten his name now, but he had the Icon label.
Oh.
So there was a renaissance, and of course, actually, there was the Commodore Music Shop. Now, I went to the Commodore Music Shop when they were on the downtown side of 42nd Street. Later on, that building was gutted, and a new thing went up, and the Commodore Music Shop moved across the street. But I remember hanging out there and listening to records. And so Bill Grauer and those people, they were part of it. They were the fundamental start.
What kind of groups?
And Eddie Condon. I mean, there was Condon's and there was Jimmy Ryan's. When I came in '48 or '47 actually, the original Ryan's was there, and Eddie Condon's was there, and Nick's was there. So I went to all of those places.
What brought you to Hamilton?
Luck. Two things have been lucky in my life. I had graduated from high school in Sweden and had no idea what I wanted to do. And my father said, "We'll send you to America." He had a younger brother in Larchmont, New York, and I came by myself on the boat, 10 days on the ship, and arrived here as a 17-year-old. So what my father basically did was he foisted the indecision of a teenager onto his younger brother. And luckily, well, I came in August, and of course, high school, I had a cousin who was a senior in Mamaroneck High School, and when he went off to school, I was sitting around the house and waiting for him to finish school and come home, and then we could go out and join with his friends and stuff. And my uncle said, "We can't have a young fellow like you sitting around the house here. I'm going to write to your father, I'm going to become your guardian, and you can go to the high school on my taxes." So that's what happened. I came to the high school maybe 3 or 4 weeks late, and I was good at ice hockey. I was on the ice hockey team, in the winter at Hamilton. And one of the fathers of one of my teammates said to my uncle, I'm going to take my son to see some colleges. Do you mind if I take your nephew? I had no idea about higher education in America. So I went with Jack Sanborn and Mr. Sanborn, and we drove up and we saw Colgate and we saw Hamilton. I stayed at the Deke House because Jerry Steiner was older, and he was from Larchmont, and he was the goalie on the hockey team. I stayed at the fraternity house, the Deke fraternity house, while Mr. Sanborn and Jack, his son, went off to see Williams, because I said, I've seen enough. I've seen 2 colleges. I don't need to go for it. They came back and got me. And then Jack and I, we both applied to Hamilton. And actually we filled out our applications at Mr. Sanborn's house in Larchmont. And he helped that. And I came up for an interview, and both Jack and I were accepted, and we decided to come here.
Do you
And
remember,
we roomed together first year.
do you remember what the tuition was?
$800 a semester. Yeah.
It's gone up a little bit since
I
then.
understand. Yeah. Well, I mean, it was a smaller college.
Yeah.
There were only men.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why I picked it over Colgate, because I thought, first of all, I thought it might be a little academically better, and I felt that would be good. But it was smaller. I thought you wouldn't get lost.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you recall any of the kinds of bands that might have played at social functions at Hamilton?
I remember one winter carnival. The pianist, whom I later met in Denmark, I can't remember his name, but he was the leader, Wilcox, Eddie Wilcox. And actually in high school I met Dot, who became my wife, and she came up for house parties. And I remember dancing with her because it wasn't my class's event. I think it might have been the senior ball or something, and it was always winter carnival, I think.
Yeah.
And there was Omer Simeon in the band playing saxophone, and I knew it and didn't dare. I was too shy. I didn't go up. And I mean, the band got here 2 hours late. They got lost. There was snow. There was everything. If I had gone up to Omer Simeon, whom I got to know later, in fact, I have one of his clarinets.
Oh.
And if I had gone up to him, he would have been flattered that someone knew him in the sticks
Yeah.
of Hamilton College. And I didn't do it. Same thing when I was at dental school in Philadelphia. On Walnut Street, there was a club called the Cork Club. Charlie Gaines was playing there. And of course I knew Charlie Gaines's name from those Fat Swallow recordings. Won't you get off it, please? And Harlem Fuss. I didn't go up and say hello to Charlie Gaines. I should have.
You know, I know exactly what you're saying, because I had a similar instance at
The
when I was in
problem was
college,
that
I
I
went to
was.
a class.
Some of it comes from being European. I said because who am I to go up and speak to these incredible people? That was
Right.
one of the impediments.
Right. And mostly they're just
And
regular people.
when you did, and you knew something about them, they were the most easy people to speak to. Yeah, I did that at one movie theater. Willie the Lion Smith was playing, and I went up and spoke to him, and he handed me his card, and it had Jewish writing on it. He was a cantor. Yeah. So I mean, you know, and then he said later on, because I had gotten to know him, he signed my book. The book he wrote.
Oh.
Yeah.
So did you get a taste of Hamilton? Did you do any concert promotion or
No.
anything like that?
No, I did nothing. At that time, I didn't have a whole lot of money. I was barely getting by, although I can't say I ever suffered any hardship. But I was more collecting, I was more learning, I was reading, I even bid on some records and stuff like that. I was more of a record collector. Now, what I learned at Hamilton was how to write a thesis or with footnotes and go to sources and all of that, and which stood me in good stead later, because later I wrote some articles and also I did research. But my interest at that time was very much focused on who's playing what on the records. And I felt a certain responsibility being European and being here in America where the musicians were. Because in Europe, all we could do was put a record on and then put the other record on and say, doesn't this trumpeter sound like the same guy? Whereas I had access to the musicians, because quite early on, by going to Jimmy Ryan's and being knocked out by the Sidney de Paris, Wilbur de Paris aggregation, I got to know Hayes Alvis, the bass player, and he was living alone.
Hayes
Alvis.
Gee, I never heard that name.
He was a bass player who played with Duke Ellington. He played in the Mills Blue Rhythm Band. He was the straw boss there, in fact. And he had played with Benny Carter and with many. And he came originally from Chicago. He was a drummer in the Chicago Defender Band at one time. And so I met him and I knew about him. And he lived, at the time that I really got to know him, was when I took the orthodontic course at Columbia University, because then I lived with my wife at 175th Street in Washington Heights, which wasn't too far from Edgecombe and 159th Street, where Hayes Alvis had a 5-room apartment on the ground floor. And we got to be very good friends. Eventually, he made me the executor of his will. And I felt that was a very bit of an honor. And he would bring musicians out. And I remember once he brought Louis Bacon, the trumpeter. And immediately when I had a little music room, when we sat in the music room, and I put on In the House Blues with Bessie Smith. And Louis Bacon said, who's that on trumpet? I said, well, the books say it's you. He said, oh no. He said, that's not me. He said, you put on New Orleans Hopscotch Blues, and you'll see, because I was an admirer of Louis Armstrong, and you'll see that I play a little bit like that. So I switched to that record, Hopscotch Blues. Sure enough, the trumpeter was totally different, and Bacon said, that's me there. So then I remember I played the record for a whole week and tried to figure out who can that trumpeter be. And finally I said, I think it might be Louis Metcalf. Well, luckily I was into this early enough. Louis Metcalf was still alive and around, and I sort of knew him. And I asked him to come to the house, and I played him In the House Blues. And he said, yes, I have to admit, that's me. But, in other words, he didn't think much of it, although it's great trumpeting. He said, you have to understand, I was playing the music of the time. They would call you up and they would say, can you growl? And you'd say yes, and you got the job.
That's a really interesting story.
But later, at a party, he was sort of divorced, and he had a wife in Canada, and he had some children, teenage children. And I remember they came to the house at the party that we had, and I went back to my music room and got them to come, and I put on preaching the blues or whatever it was with the Louis Russell Band. What's it? I forgot what it called. Oh, the Call of the Freaks. Yeah, Call of the Freaks. And I said, "This is your father playing. I want you to know how good your father was." So I got them to listen to their own father playing. But I have another Louis Metcalf story, and that is that I cut my teeth in Sweden on the Louis Russell Band. I wanted to play a saxophone because of Charlie Holmes. I thought Higgy was the greatest trombonist ever, and Henry Allen, that was one incredible band. And I remember meeting once at Ryan's Albert Nicholas, and I said to him, "What was it like playing in the Louis Russell Band?" He said, "We all spoke the same language." But back to Metcalf. He was the first trumpeter in the Louis Russell Band, and then he was replaced by Henry Red Allen. I heard Henry Red Allen, I met Henry Red Allen, but I can't say I knew him. But anyway, Louis Metcalf, Charlie Holmes said, was full of ideas, or he pronounced them ideas. And he said he was the one who did the Call of the Freaks. And Louis Russell called up Louis Metcalf and said, "We're going to go to the studio, we're going to record your number, the new Call of the Freaks, and would you like to come and be there?" So Metcalf said he did go there. He said, "I went there without my trumpet." And he said, so he identified himself as one of the vocal trio that sings "Stick Out You Can, Here Comes the Garbage Man." It's Higgy, Henry Allen, and Louis Metcalf singing. And you'd never know that unless you confronted the musician himself, because he was out of the band, he was asked to come to the studio, and so he was part of that trio.
Wow.
So those kind of things is what the detective work has interested me.
That's pretty
Yeah.
deep. Yeah. Even the fact
and it's over for me now because they're all gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I regret not having done more, not having come up with the right questions and so on and so forth, but I did what I did.
yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the things you've done. I just watching you today. Okay, I should tell the people who might be watching this that you brought part of the band up
Yeah,
to Hamilton
four
to
of us.
play. Yeah.
Yes.
And that did they come from New York?
I picked them all up.
So you went to New
individually.
York.
I picked up Zeke on the east side, uptown,
Yeah.
Jackie Williams on the west side, downtown, and then around the corner pretty much is Joey. Then I went up to the Bronx and picked up, actually on the Deegan. He's off the Deegan, and we got back on the Deegan in order to
Okay.
come up here.
And then
so it was logical, but it's still, I left the house at 9,
Right.
and we went on our way until 11:30.
And yeah, and it's 12 hours later. And so this is just, and of course I've done this kind of thing, but I was worried about you guys today. Just hoping, okay, the trip goes. And then I thought about the fact that you've taken the Harlem Blues and Jazz Band like to various parts in the world. So this is, not that this is easy today, but compared to the logistics that you have handled over the years, I'm amazed, and I appreciate the fact that you do it.
Well, I do it for myself as well. Orthodontics wasn't enough. I needed to be connected to the arts and to music particularly, and to jazz very specifically, because that was what electrified me as a teenager.
So you were able to keep it alive.
Yeah.
After
Luckily, I'm healthy. I mean, I played soccer at Hamilton. I was an All-American, honorable mention for an All New York State. So I mean, physically, I'm in good shape, and I can do this.
How did the initial idea? Was it
Well,
1973?
how it started was that the orthodontic practice that I started in '61 became successful, and we bought a big house down on the Long Island Sound, 18-room Tudor house, and there were only 3 of us in it, my wife, my daughter, and myself. And we could have 100 people. And by that time, I'd gotten to know quite a few jazz musicians, and we decided to have some parties. And they were unusual parties because everybody brought a dish of some kind. And we had probably a preponderance of black musicians, although there were quite a few whites. And some of these black ladies can really cook. So we supplied the chairs, the cups, and we had party people come and help us with chairs and all of that kind of stuff. But these parties, they got to be, people looked forward to them, and it was great. I mean, here I've got J.C. Higginbotham playing in my dining room. You know, it was a dream come true. And so at one point, I got to know Clyde Bernhardt. And so at March 5th or March 3rd, 1973, at one of the parties, in a rash moment, I said to Clyde, we ought to form a band. And he said, well, okay, if you'll take care of most of the business part, and I'll certainly go along. So that's how the Harlem Blues and Jazz Band formed, from these parties. And this was 1973, and we made our first trip to Scandinavia in 76. Now, I was in my 40s, and the guys were all in their 60s.
How'd you balance that with your work life?
It worked out fine because as an orthodontist, you don't see your patients you see one today and then the next appointment is 3 weeks away. So what it would, and also we some of us who had graduated from Columbia formed a cover group. Mm-hmm. So that if somebody was sick or wanted to take a vacation, we would cover the emergencies of that. There were 6 of us who formed this group. So I could go away for 2 and 3 weeks. It took a lot of doing because I had to almost see all my patients before I left. And then when I got back,
back to real life.
Yeah. But I mean, also actually because of the dentistry, I was able to help many of the musicians. I've had incredible patients. I mean, I'll just give one little story. How I started, before I got involved and had the big house, I belonged to the Connecticut Traditional Jazz Club, which was formed by Bill Bissonette, who's a trombonist and a absolute rabid New Orleans. Nothing is any good if it's not from New Orleans. Anyway, he had his own band, and he couldn't run a club and put on the concerts and all that. So he put out a call for people to come and help him run a club. And what happened, the way I saw it, was I don't know if you know, there was Indian Joe off 6th Avenue upstairs, had a record shop. Okay. He was apparently an Indian, and he had all these jazz records. It was just jazz records on the 2nd floor, and I used to go there. And on the door, entering into the record shop, was a poster saying, that Bill Bissonette had put out, asking for people to come and help him and join this. So I answered that, and some of our meetings were up in Hamden, Connecticut. I mean, I drove 2 hours to a meeting and would come home late and all of that. But anyway, we were nonprofit. We put on concerts in various Holiday Inns, 8 concerts a year. This was before Jaffe had organized it in New Orleans. We could call up the guys directly. We brought them up on the red eye, that was the cheapest. We put them up in our homes. And a lot of, at that time I didn't have the big house, and I would put them up upstairs in my house, and they all wanted to come to me because I could reline their dentures and so on and so forth. They knew I had my dental office in my house at that time. So I remember Albert Burbank, and he said, "What is your name?" And I said, "My name is Al, for Albert." "Oh, that's an easy name for me to remember," he said. And then he said, "You know, I understand you're a dentist." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you know, sometimes when I sing, my upper denture drops down, and it's very embarrassing." I said, "I can take care of that. We'll reline your denture." So I did. I relined his denture, and you know, they were happy. I helped Louis Nelson. I helped Andrew Morgan. Those were the New Orleans guys.
Uh-huh.
And once Punch Miller was staying at Bill Bissonet's house in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is about an hour, a little more than an hour away from me. And he calls me up in the morning and he says, "We're going to record West End Blues. And Punch can't hit the high D because something's going on with his teeth. Can you take a look?" So he brought him down, and I looked, and I saw that he was missing an upper molar. He had a partial denture, and I figured the air was going out there. And luckily, I had a wonderful, wonderful lab guy. I took impressions, and Bill Bissonet went back up to Connecticut. Punch stayed with me, and I remember Dot serving him lunch. And at that point, I had taken impressions, and they were now at the lab. And back it came with a tooth where it was necessary for it to be. And Bill Bissonette came back, picked him up, and they recorded, and he hit the high D. And I said, "Okay, Bill, now you got to do something for me. I know you and your wife go to work in the morning. I want to come up there, and Punch is staying at your house. I want to have Punch completely to myself. And I want to play him the records and see, because there are dubious things about where he might be."
Mm-hmm.
The record I really wanted to play for him, which I did, was early on when Christmas morn, Jesus Christ the King was born, by the Cotton Top Mountain something or other. I had it on a 78, and there's a brilliant trumpet there that takes two choruses, and it's kind of tricky execution, kind of tricky, and I thought it was Punch. I put the record on, and Punch said, "Oh no." Punch said, "Who's that?" "That's not me." He said, "That's not my style." And then I played him the Tiny Parhams, and sure enough, he identified himself where we know he is. And then I put on the same record over again. I said, "Punch, here's another record." He denied it again. And it was listed in the books at that time, the Cotton Top Mountain Singers or something. And so he denied himself twice, and I tried to trick him. But so my experience with playing records for the musicians, they know their own work, they won't claim anything they didn't do, and you need to double check what they might say about who else is on the record.
I see.
Yeah, that was how my philosophy.
Did you, or do you, distinguish between white and black players?
In a way I do, because there is a deeper blues feeling to the black playing, I feel, and that's why I put blues first. Chris Barber's band in England is Chris Barber's Jazz and Blues Band.
Mm-hmm.
Mine is the Harlem, because I wanted to honor Harlem's contribution. Everybody knows about Chicago, everybody knows about New Orleans, but Harlem, I thought I might get a little bit of a mystique or a cachet from the name, and I wanted to honor Harlem, so I said Harlem, and then I wanted blues to come first. In the beginning, it was a cumbersome name, the Harlem Blues and Jazz Band, but people are used to it now.
Yeah. Yeah, a name becomes a good name if it has a good band. Eventually the name...
So there was reason behind every word. Harlem, Blues, and Jazz Band.
But your band has been more about Ellington than...
Well, basically what the band is that I don't tell anybody how to play. But if I hear that they've got a blues inflection to their playing, well, that interests me. And also, depending on, I mean, when I had access to the musicians who had done the recordings that I had collected, so I went after some of them, especially if they'd had any connection to King Oliver. Clyde had sung blues with King Oliver and played with him in the 30s. In fact, Clyde Bernhardt is rather interesting because when he was with Jay McShann, later in the 40s, Charlie Parker was in that band. So Clyde Bernhardt represents almost a microcosm of the history of jazz, having played with King Oliver and Charlie Parker. There's almost nobody else who has. And the thing is just the character of the band changes with the musicians in it. So when Clyde left and Eddie Durham came into the band, there was a whole different approach.
Now your average age has gone up since then. Is that right?
Well,
or not?
not necessarily. They've always, it's always been musicians pretty much over 60.
Yeah. But now you have...
we got Fred Staten at 102. And of course, Larry Lucy played in the band, and Larry Lucy lived to be 101. And so they're there. And many of them got to be 90. I mean, Johnny Williams, who was the original bass player, who was in the band for 25 years, he was 90 before and he died. And Laura Watson, who was one of the singers, she was just about 90. Certainly when Clyde discovered in his church in Newark, the New Eden Baptist Church in Newark, he discovered Princess White, who is her real name was Princess White Durrah, D-U-R-R-A-H, and he discovered her in his church, and he went up to her and he said, "Are you Princess White?" And she said, "Yes." And then he said, "Well, I remember," she was 94 at the time, and Clyde said, "I remember that in 1924, at the Lafayette Theater, and I've forgotten what state, I delivered a telegram to you," because Clyde was the first black telegram boy out of Baden, South Carolina. And he said, "I delivered a telegram to you and you tipped me $1. And Clyde had the best memory of anybody I've ever met. He was a researcher's dream. Phil Schaap used to try to trick him. But you couldn't. He said, "Oh no," Phil would say, "Well, wasn't that on December 21st? And you said it, no, wasn't that on December 20th? And you said it was on 21st. Well, Clyde would say, "Well, look, we went in the studio late, and by the time we recorded this, it was the 21st. And he remembered everybody who was in the band when he joined it and the date that he joined. Wow. The changes that occurred in the band while he was there and the date he left.
The Louis Russell Band.
No, Clyde played primarily with Edgar Hayes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Edgar Hayes and King Oliver in the 30s.
Yeah.
Clyde was a. I mean, when I took him to England, and the English guys, Laurie Wright and John Chilton and all of them. I mean, they were just flabbergasted because he remembered everything.
Wow.
In fact, there's a book written about him called "I Remember" by a wonderful jazz researcher. Now his name escapes me. He's deceased. He lived in Brooklyn. No. Huh.
You got to collaborate with Congressman John Conyers. Right?
Well, we didn't collaborate. Actually, in the documentary movie that Anya Barron did on the band, the first documentary movie, I had shown her what the proclamation that John Conyers had made about jazz, that it should be promulgated and respected and so on and so forth. So she said, let's go down to Washington and interview him. And that's how that came about. We went down there and we put him on camera. Yeah. And so he's in the movie. Yeah.
What did your wife and daughter think of this passion of yours?
I think my wife was very supportive. I think she enjoyed meeting all these people. My daughter liked it. It wasn't her kind of music, but I remember once when Helen Humes sang in our house, she was knocked over by Helen Humes' singing. And she liked Laurel Watson, because Lisa wanted to sing and Laurel gave her some pointers. And so she kind of, I think they liked or they respected what I was doing. Yeah, and they enjoyed it. They enjoyed it, I think.
Well, it must be rewarding and then difficult at the same time.
It was difficult for my wife because I got to go away with the band sometimes. And I remember Lisa saying once to my daughter, well, why do we always have to go on a vacation with the band?
Yeah. But also the fact that you're getting these people in the band and then eventually many of them pass away.
Yeah.
That's a big emotional investment on your part.
Well, yes. Some of it was quite shocking. Haywood Henry was in the band, and Haywood had a sore spot on his lower denture. And he called while I went home for lunch. I had two houses. I kept the house where I had the office, and I bought this other big house 5 or 6 minutes away. And I went home for lunch. I came back and I knew that Haywood had called around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And I had so many patients waiting for me when I got back that I had to see them all. I didn't get to call Haywood's home until 5 o'clock that afternoon. And I got his wife and she said, Haywood's dead. So he had had a massive heart attack. She said he was sitting in bed reading the newspaper. The newspaper flew out of his hand and a massive heart attack, and he was gone. Now, I was amazed that Haywood joined the band because he was a big name. Haywood was something else. Mm-hmm. But, you know, the distressing part is that I'm an amateur, and I'm not aggressive. And here are these guys who are the top of their profession, and they're not respected, they don't have jobs, and here they are, they can join me.
Well, I noticed you're hitting on something that I know exactly what you're saying, because early on I was doing these interviews, and at the end of it, many musicians would basically hit me up for a gig.
Big one?
They'd hit me up for a gig.
Yeah.
They would ask, I didn't phrase that very well, but they'd ask about, look, why don't you bring me
up to Hamilton?
Up to Hamilton.
Yeah.
Because
Joey, I'm sure.
Sure. And at first I was really surprised because I had this same thing like, oh my God, these are people I've been listening to all my life. Don't they have it made?
A good friend of mine from high school that I ran into, he was the other jazz guy in the high school, and we kept up a long time. He felt like that Ben Webster should have been given a stipend of $10,000 a year in order to stay in the country, so he didn't have to live in Denmark.
Mm-hmm. Why is it? Why is jazz not?
I think, first of all, it's primarily black music. Secondly, it's syncopated, it's not classical, and there's prejudice against anything that's not classical primarily. There's the snootiness to it. And, unfortunately, some of that has rubbed off even on the jazz musicians who feel they've got to go to Juilliard. But, of course, it's changed. At one time it was very emotional, and you didn't have to go to school, you had to feel it. But now maybe in order to come up with a different way of playing or approaching it in another way, or I don't say to advance it, but to change it, maybe you have to come at it from a different perspective. I'm still stuck in the older way.
Yeah. You and me,
yeah,
both. but it's become
somebody like Phil Shapp. I mean, he does the whole spectrum. I mean, I prefer Hodges to Parker, which is a heresy.
Yeah, but I'm with you because my favorite people are not usually the real innovators. It's the people that may take from them. And at any rate, jazz is now a highly respected art form, but it's not any easier to make a living at it unless you go through academia.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I wish I had succeeded a little bit more to get on the college circuit and present that what I really am presenting in a way is the history of jazz music.
But I think most colleges are always thinking, they're always trying to be on the cutting edge.
Yeah.
So they're more likely to.
Yeah, they'll get somebody
to get
somebody or
right.
Yeah.
So it's a niche within a niche that you're working in.
Well, I mean, I think that the entire spectrum could be brought up. I think, to me, in other words, we don't try to improve on Bach. We try to play it the way it was in his time. So why don't we do the same thing with King Oliver? But I think eventually that'll happen. There were some people who did try to do repertory bands, not too successfully. But I think succeeding generations will rediscover the early jazz because it's too good. It just isn't going to go away.